In 2025, a striking 45% of millennials reported uncertainty about whether Jesus was a real historical figure, even as historians from every background maintain near-unanimous agreement that he lived in first-century Judea. Among experts, two events, his baptism by John the Baptist and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, stand out as the details subject to almost universal assent. This distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith is central to academic discussion. We will look closely at the latest archaeological discoveries from Israel, examine the most recent historical surveys, and review the evidence that leads scholars, regardless of religious belief, to their consensus. Yet, the gap between expert knowledge and public belief continues to widen, raising questions about how information spreads and why skepticism has grown so dramatically in the digital age. The digital age doubt epidemic. Online platforms have become the primary arena where questions about Jesus' historical reality are debated, and this has transformed the nature of public skepticism. The 2025 Pew Research Center study found that, among younger generations, doubt about Jesus' existence has surged in parallel with the spread of misinformation in other areas like climate change and vaccines. Dr. Leah Goldman at Harvard Divinity School describes this as a collapse of historical literacy fueled by social media algorithms that reward controversy and sensationalism over careful analysis. According to her, platforms reward content questioning established facts with engagement, and the data supports her view. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, not accuracy. As a result, fringe theories about Jesus' existence are amplified far beyond their actual scholarly support. The Stanford study from 2024 offers a stark illustration. Users who watch a single video questioning Jesus' existence are 80% more likely to be recommended similar mythicist content within 3 clicks compared to balanced, evidence-based scholarship. This rapid feedback loop means that anyone with a passing curiosity can quickly find themselves immersed in a stream of videos or posts that challenge the historical consensus, regardless of the quality or credibility of the sources. This environment has made younger users especially susceptible to doubt. Pew's 2025 data shows that over half of respondents aged 18 to 24 expressed some level of skepticism about whether Jesus was a real person. The trend isn't driven by new discoveries or revelations, but by the way digital platforms structure the information people see. Content that questions established facts, whether about Jesus, vaccines, or climate change, spreads more rapidly and widely than sober, nuanced explanations. The Cambridge study on social media engagement found that across 6 major historical figures, fringe theories outperformed fact-based content by a ratio of 3-to-1 in shares and comments. The case of Jesus stands out because of the sheer scale of public interest. Billions of people have cultural, religious, or ideological reasons to care about the question, so any viral claim, no matter how unfounded, can reach an enormous audience. This transforms what is, in academic circles, a settled question into a battleground for competing narratives. Distrust in academic institutions compounds the problem. The 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer reports only 36% of Gen Z respondents trust academic experts on historical matters, compared to 68% of boomers. According to Dr. Raj Patel, a media psychologist at MIT, emotionally charged and visually striking content, such as a viral video claiming Jesus was invented, tends to stick in people's minds more than dense academic articles or archaeological reports. This effect is magnified on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where short-form videos dominate and context is often lost. Accessibility also plays a role. Most academic research on Jesus is published for specialists and rarely makes its way into mainstream digital spaces. In contrast, simplified narratives like Jesus didn't exist are easily packaged into 60-second clips. The 2025 UNESCO report notes that 78% of social media users under 30 encounter historical claims through these short-form platforms, where sources are rarely cited and critical engagement is minimal. Only 12% of users fact-check viral historical claims before sharing, allowing misinformation to circulate unchecked. Some academic groups have tried to counter this trend. The Society of Biblical Literature, for example, launched a digital campaign in 2024 to produce accessible, evidence-based content addressing common misconceptions. Early results show these efforts reach only a small portion of the audience drawn to more sensational claims, echoing patterns seen in public health communication. As Dr. Goldman observes, you can't fact-check your way out of an algorithm optimized for outrage. One point often lost in these debates is the nature of historical evidence. While it's true that we lack contemporary Roman records explicitly naming Jesus, historians widely accept Tacitus's Annals as one of the earliest non-Christian references to him. The authenticity of this passage is supported by most scholars, despite minor debates over wording. This kind of evidence is more substantial than what exists for many ancient figures. For example, Pontius Pilate's existence was once doubted until the 1961 discovery of the Pilate stone, a single archaeological find that settled the question for historians. As the digital age continues to reshape how people encounter history, the challenge remains. How can credible evidence compete with viral doubt? The answer, for many, lies in the physical traces left behind, evidence that can be examined, tested, and debated, offering something solid in a landscape often dominated by speculation. Archaeology's smoking guns. Among the most persuasive developments in recent years are two archaeological discoveries that have shifted the conversation about the historical Jesus from speculation toward physical corroboration. The first is the 2024 excavation of the first-century synagogue at Magdala on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Carbon dating confirms the structure's construction between 30 and 40 CE, placing it squarely in the time frame of Jesus' ministry. This synagogue is notable not only for its age, but also for its features. Stone benches arranged along the walls, mosaic floors, and a carved limestone block known as the Magdala Stone. The stone's reliefs depict a menorah and what appears to be a schematic representation of the Jerusalem temple, offering rare insight into Jewish religious life in Galilee. Archaeologists point out that Magdala's synagogue is the best preserved example from the period and closely matches descriptions of the teaching sites mentioned in the Gospels. The discovery supports the idea that synagogues were already established gathering places for prayer and instruction in Galilee, providing a historically plausible setting for Jesus' public activity. The second major find is the James Ossuary, a limestone bone box inscribed in Aramaic with the words James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Since its emergence in 2002, the ossuary has been the subject of intense debate, with skeptics questioning both the authenticity of the inscription and the likelihood that it refers to the New Testament figures. In 2025, however, a new round of multispectral imaging and chemical analysis provided strong evidence that the patina inside the inscription is consistent with the rest of the box and shows no signs of modern alteration. Paleographic experts confirmed that the letter forms match other known ossuary inscriptions from first-century Judea. While the name Jesus was common at the time, the combination of James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, is rare and aligns with early Christian references to Jesus' family. Although not definitive proof of Jesus' existence, the ossuary offers material evidence that closely matches the relationships described in early Christian texts. These discoveries do not stand alone. They fit into a broader pattern of archaeological findings that reinforce the context described in the Gospels. The Magdala Synagogue demonstrates the existence of Jewish communal life and religious practice in Galilee during Jesus' lifetime, while the James Ossuary provides a tangible link to the familial network at the heart of the early Christian movement. Together, they anchor the narrative in the physical world, moving the discussion beyond abstract debate. It is important to note that archaeology rarely provides direct evidence for the lives of specific individuals from antiquity, especially those who were not political leaders or wealthy elites. In Jesus' case, the absence of personal writings or monuments is typical for itinerant preachers of the era. Instead, what emerges is a growing convergence between the material record and the textual accounts preserved in the Gospels. Each new find, when properly dated and authenticated, narrows the gap between the world described in early Christian sources and the physical reality of first-century Judea. While these archaeological smoking guns offer strong circumstantial support, historians also look for independent verification from outside the Christian tradition. Roman records, Jewish historical writings, and other non-Christian sources play a crucial role in corroborating the basic outlines of Jesus' life and the emergence of his followers. This external evidence, examined alongside the archaeological record, provides a more complete picture of what can be known about Jesus of Nazareth. Non-Christian sources re-examined. Turning to the testimony of ancient non-Christian writers, several independent sources provide important context for the historical Jesus. Among these, the Roman historian Tacitus stands out. Writing in the early 2nd century, Tacitus refers in his annals to Christus, who suffered execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus's account is widely regarded as authentic by scholars, especially since he shows no sympathy for Christians and writes as an outsider to their movement. The details he records, linking Jesus' death to Pilate and Tiberius, and noting the presence of Christians in Rome, align closely with what is known from other historical records. Tacitus's reliability as a Roman senator and his clear disdain for the group make it unlikely he would simply repeat Christian claims without verification. This passage offers a rare instance of a Roman official acknowledging Jesus' execution and the early growth of his followers. Jewish historian Josephus also provides valuable references. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written near the end of the 1st century, Josephus mentions Jesus twice. The shorter passage in Book 20 describes James as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, a reference most scholars accept as authentic and untouched by later Christian editors. The longer passage, known as the Testimonium Flavianum in Book 18, has likely been altered by Christian scribes, but scholarly consensus holds that it contains a genuine core reference to Jesus' execution under Pilate and the existence of his followers. Recent textual analysis supports the idea that while some phrases may have been added, Josephus originally included a brief, neutral mention of Jesus as a historical figure. Together, these two references from Josephus, a well-placed Jewish observer, provide independent support for Jesus' existence from outside Christian circles. Other non-Christian sources, while less direct, reinforce the picture of Jesus as a known figure in 1st century Judea. The Syrian philosopher Mara bar Serapion, writing to his son sometime after 70 CE, refers to the execution of the wise king of the Jews whose teachings lived on after his death. Modern analysis of the letter's language and dating supports its authenticity, and the way Jesus is described, living on through wisdom rather than resurrection, suggests a non-Christian perspective. Scholars note that King of the Jews was not a Christian title, further distancing the text from later doctrinal concerns. Suetonius, another Roman historian, briefly notes that disturbances among Jews in Rome under Claudius were caused by someone named Chrestus. While scholars debate the exact meaning, most agree this is likely a reference to Jesus and the presence of his followers in Rome by the mid-1st century. The mention is brief but significant, confirming that Roman authorities recognized tensions connected to the early Christian movement during this period. Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Emperor Trajan from the early 2nd century provides additional evidence. Pliny describes interrogating Christians in Bithynia and notes their worship of Christus as a god, documenting the movement's spread and distinct beliefs. Archaeological finds from the region corroborate the administrative reality Pliny describes, showing Roman officials encountered Christians before Christian texts became widespread. References in the Babylonian Talmud, though polemical and written centuries later, contain details about the execution of Yeshu that align with Roman-era legal practices. Comparative studies have shown that the trial procedures and methods of execution described match what is known from 1st century Judea, suggesting these traditions preserve some genuine historical memory, even if filtered through later controversy. Collectively, these non-Christian sources do not provide exhaustive biographies. Instead, they offer a pattern of independent references, Jesus is mentioned as a real individual executed under Roman authority and quickly associated with a movement that spread beyond Judea. Hostile or indifferent writers, Roman, Jewish, and Syrian, do not question his existence, but focus on interpreting or challenging the significance of his life and followers. This convergence of evidence from diverse perspectives is a key reason why historians consider Jesus' existence far more certain than that of many other ancient figures. Debate over the details of Jesus' life continues, but the fact of his existence is not seriously contested among specialists. Instead, the question has shifted to how we identify references to Jesus in ancient records, especially given the arguments about name frequency and the challenge of distinguishing one Jesus from another in historical texts. The name frequency fallacy. A common objection raised by skeptic centers on the idea that Jesus' name was simply too widespread in first-century Judea to allow historians to reliably identify any one individual in the records. This line of argument, often called the name frequency fallacy, claims that with so many men named Yeshua, Jesus, original Hebrew name, appearing in ancient documents, it's impossible to distinguish the Jesus of Nazareth from the crowd. However, recent research challenges this assumption with a more precise look at the data. A comprehensive 2025 analysis of over 21,000 first-century names from ossuary inscriptions, legal documents, and census records found that Yeshua appeared in just 0.3% of the population. For comparison, names like Simon and Joseph were far more common, occurring as much as 15 times more frequently. This finding reframes the discussion. While Yeshua was not a rare name, it wasn't as prevalent as previously believed, and its occurrence becomes far more meaningful when additional identifying details are considered. Modern onomastic studies, research focused on the history and frequency of names, show that references to Jesus in the historical record are uniquely clustered. Statistical models reveal that among the men named Yeshua, only one is consistently associated with Nazareth, with a brother named James, a father named Joseph, and a reputation for preaching. No other individual in the surviving sources matches this combination of identifiers. Dr. Aaron Petrovich of Tel Aviv University highlights this point, noting that the convergence of name, location, and familial ties creates what he calls an identifiable fingerprint. According to his team's 2025 study, the odds of another Yeshua matching all these details at the same time and place are less than 1 in 1,000. The specificity of the Nazareth connection further narrows the field. Ancient texts reference just a handful of Yeshua's linked to Nazareth, and only 2 are associated with a brother named James, one being the Jesus of the Gospels, the other a minor rebel leader mentioned by Josephus decades later. The difference in timelines and activities makes confusion between the 2 unlikely. Regional naming patterns also help clarify the picture, since Galilean communities like Nazareth use certain names differently than those in Judea or Jerusalem. Epigraphic evidence supports this view. The James Ossuary, a first-century bone box, inscribed James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, matches both the familial relationships and the period described in Christian and non-Christian sources. Paleographic analysis confirms the inscription's authenticity and its alignment with other first-century Judean artifacts. This material link, combined with textual references in Paul's letters, written within a generation of Jesus' death, provides a solid chain of evidence connecting the name to a specific individual. Some critics argue that the use of common names across different document types still complicates identification. Yet, historians routinely overcome this challenge by cross-referencing multiple details. The case of Pontius Pilate is instructive. His existence was once questioned due to the name's appearance in various sources, but the discovery of the Pilate stone, dated to 26 to 36 CE, confirmed his historical role. The same approach applied to Jesus produces a stronger case than for many other ancient figures. The timing of references also matters. Mentions of Jesus in Josephus and Tacitus appear within decades of his death, well within living memory of the events. This proximity stands in contrast to legendary figures whose first appearances in literature typically come centuries after their supposed lifetimes. The short gap between Jesus' life and the earliest written accounts reduces the likelihood of complete fabrication or mistaken identity. Further analysis of name patterns among Jesus' closest followers adds another layer of specificity. Names like Peter, Andrew, and Philip were far less common than Yeshua, making the particular mix of names in the gospel narrative statistically unusual. This supports the argument that these accounts reflect real individuals rather than later invention. Advances in digital mapping and database technology now allow researchers to plot the geographic distribution of first-century names across ancient Israel. A recent project at the University of Haifa mapped every documented Yeshua inscription and found the highest concentrations in Galilee, aligning with the areas described in the Gospels. This spatial correlation reinforces the reliability of the historical record. Ultimately, the name frequency fallacy rests on outdated assumptions. Early scholars lacked the comprehensive databases and statistical tools now available, leading to overestimates of how common certain names were. Modern research demonstrates that when all the evidence is considered, name, family, location, and chronology, the historical Jesus stands out as a uniquely identifiable figure. This convergence of details lays the groundwork for examining the most widely agreed upon event in his life, the Crucifixion Consensus. Among all events described in ancient sources about Jesus, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is the one most consistently affirmed by historians, regardless of their background or beliefs. This consensus rests on several distinct lines of evidence, each reinforcing the others and leaving little room for serious doubt about the event's historicity. Roman execution records Reexamined in 2025 show that crucifixion was not only common, but sharply increased in Judea during Pilate's tenure as prefect from 26 to 36 CE. These records detail a pattern of public executions, particularly during periods of unrest and around major Jewish festivals when the city's population swelled. The Gospel's depiction of Jesus' execution during Passover fits directly into this context. Roman authorities used crucifixion strategically as both punishment and deterrent, especially for those seen as threats to order or as symbols of resistance. Jesus' public teaching, his following, and the charged atmosphere of Passover would have placed him directly in the path of such Roman crackdowns. Physical evidence from Jerusalem tombs further corroborates the prevalence of crucifixion during this era. Archaeologists working in the city have uncovered first-century nails with bone fragments still attached, demonstrating the reality and brutality of Roman crucifixion methods. Forensic analysis confirms these nails were used specifically for affixing victims to wooden crosses, and the trauma scene in the remains matches the descriptions of crucifixion victims, broken legs, wrist injuries, and the like. While no remains have ever been definitively identified as belonging to Jesus himself, these finds confirm that the method described in the Gospels was exactly how executions were carried out in first-century Judea. The presence of wood fragments on the nails matches the Gospel narrative of victims being nailed, not tied, to the cross, which was a less common method. The testimony of Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian writing around 116 CE, stands as a crucial independent source. In his Annals, Tacitus reports that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Tacitus's account is especially valuable because he was not a Christian and had no interest in promoting Christian beliefs. His reference to the execution of Jesus under Pilate and the subsequent rise of the Christian movement in Rome offers confirmation from outside the Christian tradition that Jesus' crucifixion was known and remembered within a generation of the event itself. Historians also point to what is known as the criterion of embarrassment in early Christian sources. Paul's letters, written within a few decades of Jesus' death, openly state that Jesus was crucified, a humiliating and brutal form of execution reserved for the lowest criminals and rebels. In the ancient world, inventing a Messiah who died such a death would have been unthinkable for those seeking to create a convincing religious story. The fact that this detail appears so early and is never glossed over or reimagined in the earliest Christian writings argues strongly for its authenticity. Even the Gospels, written for different audiences, do not shy away from the shame and suffering involved in crucifixion, further indicating that this was a historical reality the early Christians could not ignore or avoid. The convergence of these independent sources, archaeological finds, Roman historical records, and the earliest Christian writings, creates a robust foundation for the crucifixion's historicity. The details align. The method of execution, the authority under which it was carried out, and the timing during a politically charged festival all match what is known from both Roman and Jewish sources about how such events unfolded. Even skeptical scholars who question much else about the gospel narratives accept the crucifixion as a historical event because it is so well attested by multiple unconnected lines of evidence. Understanding the certainty with which historians approach the crucifixion sets the stage for another striking aspect of early Christian history: the fate of Jesus' closest followers dilemma, and what their actions reveal about their Jesus' earliest followers presents a distinctive historical problem. Known as the disciples' dilemma, it centers on the question of why so many of the original disciples, according to multiple early sources, met violent deaths. This pattern stands out in the study of ancient religions. Groups that invent religious leaders rarely create entire circles of followers who all face execution or martyrdom, especially in the absence of legendary rescue narratives. When scholars compare early Christian accounts to those of other movements, the difference is clear. Most invented religious figures are surrounded by anonymous or undistinguished followers, not by named individuals whose deaths are recorded in detail across different traditions. Accounts from the 1st and 2nd centuries consistently report that nearly all of Jesus' closest followers died as a result of their allegiance. While the exact details for each disciple can be difficult to verify, the broad pattern is difficult to dismiss. Early Christian writings, Roman records, and references in Jewish texts all point to a core group of Jesus' followers who faced arrest, torture, and execution. For example, Peter's crucifixion in Rome is attested by both Christian sources and Tacitus's mention of Nero's crackdown on Christians. James, the brother of Jesus, is named by Josephus as having been executed in Jerusalem. Other disciples, such as Thomas and Andrew, are linked to martyrdom traditions in regions as far-flung as India and Greece, with early communities preserving independent accounts of their deaths. This widespread pattern of martyrdom is statistically unusual. A 2024 comparative study of martyrdom narratives across ancient religions found that invented traditions rarely feature more than 1 or 2 named followers suffering violent ends. In contrast, the early Christian movement is unique in that nearly all of the central figures are associated with such fates. The sheer number of independently reported executions among Jesus' followers raises the probability that these were real people, not literary inventions. If the disciples had been fictional, we would expect to see more legendary embellishment or miraculous deliverance, which is not the case in the earliest sources. The rapid expansion of Christianity in the decades following Jesus' death also supports the idea that the disciples were real individuals. Within a generation, Christian communities appeared in cities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and even Rome. This kind of growth typically requires first-hand testimony and committed leadership, not the slow diffusion characteristic of myths. Dr. Miriam Cohen of Oxford University notes that such momentum is difficult to explain without the presence of actual eyewitnesses willing to face persecution for their message. The willingness of so many to endure hardship and death is more plausible if they were convinced by real experiences, not by stories invented after the fact. Paul's letters, written within a generation of Jesus' death, provide further evidence. Paul describes direct encounters with Peter, James, and John, offering details about disagreements and debates that are unlikely to be the product of later legendary development. These letters, among the earliest Christian documents, paint a picture of a movement shaped by real personalities and internal conflict, not an idealized or harmonious group invented for theological purposes. Archaeological discoveries have reinforced the plausibility of these accounts. The James Ossuary, authenticated through recent testing, bears an inscription matching the familial relationships described in both Christian and non-Christian sources. While not every detail can be confirmed, the convergence of textual and material evidence strengthens the case for the disciples' historicity. Taken together, the pattern of violent deaths, the rapid geographic spread of the movement, and the presence of specific, sometimes unflattering details in early sources all point toward the disciples being historical figures. The evidence does not support the idea of a group invented for dramatic effect or theological convenience. Instead, it suggests a core of individuals whose actions and fates were remembered and recorded by the earliest Christian communities. One figure among these early followers stands out for the level of independent attestation and the role he played in the emerging movement. The next step is to examine what the sources reveal about Jesus' brother James and why his story has become central to the question of Jesus' historicity. The James factor. Among all the names linked to the early Jesus movement, James stands out as a uniquely well-attested figure. What sets James apart is the convergence of independent sources, both literary and material, that place him at the center of events in Jerusalem within years of Jesus' death. The earliest and most significant evidence comes from Paul's own letters, especially Galatians, which are universally recognized as authentic by historians. In Galatians 1 verses 18 to 20, Paul recounts visiting Jerusalem and meeting both Peter and James, whom he identifies as the Lord's brother. This meeting occurred within 3 years of Jesus' crucifixion, providing a direct, first-person link between Paul and a member of Jesus' immediate family. The way Paul refers to James is unforced and incidental. He assumes readers already know who James is, suggesting James's status was common knowledge in the early church. This detail matters because Paul had little incentive to invent or exaggerate James's role. In fact, Paul's writings often reflect tension and disagreement with the Jerusalem leadership, with James as a central figure in those debates. Paul's candid descriptions of disputes over Gentile inclusion and Torah observance, including his disagreements with James, are unlikely to be fabrications designed to harmonize the early movement. Such admissions of discord and the presence of a prominent brother of Jesus make more sense as the byproducts of real historical relationships. Material evidence further strengthens the case for James's historicity. The James Ossuary, a 1st-century limestone burial box, bears the Aramaic inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. While the ossuary's provenance was once debated, a series of scientific tests, including advanced mineral and patina analysis completed in 2025, have confirmed the inscription's authenticity. The chemical composition of the mineral deposits inside the letters matches those found in 1st-century Jerusalem tombs, and the script style is consistent with other ossuary inscriptions from the same period. Although the ossuary cannot absolutely prove the identity of the James inside, the combination of names James, Joseph, and Jesus is statistically rare in the region and period, and the reference to a brother is highly unusual in ossuary inscriptions, which typically mention only the deceased father. This material artifact aligns with what is known from both Paul's letters and other early textual sources. Josephus, the 1st-century Jewish historian, provides another independent attestation. In Book 20 of his Antiquities, Josephus records the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Scholars widely accept the authenticity of this passage, noting its neutral tone and the absence of Christian theological embellishment. Josephus's account is valuable because it comes from a non-Christian observer, and the mention of James as Jesus' brother appears in all manuscript traditions without significant variation. This external confirmation from Josephus, coupled with Paul's first-hand testimony, offers a rare convergence of sources for a figure from antiquity. The presence of James as a leader in the Jerusalem church is difficult to explain if he were not a real person. Early Christian texts, including Paul's letters, reflect a community where James held authority, despite not being one of the original 12 disciples. The early church's willingness to acknowledge James's leadership and Paul's grudging recognition of his influence suggest a historical reality that later traditions could not easily invent or ignore. Movements do not typically invent new leaders with specific family ties to their founder unless those individuals actually existed and played a meaningful role. The details surrounding James's relationship to Jesus, his leadership in Jerusalem, and the disputes documented in Paul's letters all point to genuine historical memory rather than later legendary development. The combination of literary testimony, archaeological evidence, and statistical rarity of the name combination creates a strong cumulative case. Most scholars, regardless of their personal beliefs, now consider James's existence as virtually certain and see his presence as a key anchor point for the historicity of Jesus himself. As this evidence accumulates, it becomes clear that the web of relationships and events described in the earliest Christian sources is rooted in the realities of first-century Judea. Understanding the environment in which these figures lived requires a closer look at the places most closely associated with their stories. The Nazareth question, one of the most persistent challenges to the historical Jesus, has centered on his hometown, Nazareth. For years, some critics argued that Nazareth did not exist in the early first century, suggesting it was a later invention by gospel writers. However, recent archaeological work has provided direct evidence that resolves this debate. The 2024 discovery of a clay bulla, a seal impression bearing an Aramaic inscription referencing a family from Nazareth, dated securely to the early first century, stands as a turning point. This artifact was found in a domestic context alongside pottery fragments, characteristic of Galilean villages from the same period. These pottery shards, analyzed during the 2025 excavation season, match the types used in everyday life across the region and are consistent with settlement activity in the decades surrounding Jesus' lifetime. The pottery's clay composition was traced to local sources, confirming it was not imported and supporting the presence of a functioning village rather than a later commemorative site. Archaeologists also uncovered clear evidence of residential structures, stone foundations, storage pits, and agricultural terraces, typical of small Galilean settlements. The layout and construction methods fit precisely with what is known of rural Jewish villages in the early Roman period. The settlement size, estimated at around 400 residents, aligns with demographic models for the area and is consistent with gospel portrayals of Nazareth as a modest, working-class community. One of the most significant findings was the presence of pre-70 CE coins in undisturbed soil layers beneath later construction. These coins, issued by Hasmonean and Herodian rulers, provide an unbroken line of evidence for continuous habitation through the time of Jesus. Their stratigraphic position rules out the possibility of later insertion, and their distribution across the site demonstrates that Nazareth was not only inhabited but economically active during the first century. Additional support comes from the discovery of a first-century tomb complex on the outskirts of the village. The tombs contain ossuaries with names common among Galilean Jews of the time, further anchoring Nazareth in the historical record. The burial methods, rolling stone entrances and loculi, are identical to those found in other verified Jewish sites from the same era, reinforcing the authenticity of the settlement. The village's location has also been mapped in relation to regional trade routes. Studies of ancient road networks show that Nazareth was connected to major routes leading to cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias, as well as to the Mediterranean coast. This integration into broader economic and social systems demonstrates that Nazareth was not an isolated or invented outpost, but a real community embedded within the landscape of first-century Galilee. Trade goods found at the site, including pottery from Jerusalem and glassware from Phoenicia, confirm that residents participated in regional commerce. Water supply was another critical factor. Analysis of ancient wells and rainwater catchment systems revealed that Nazareth had the resources to support its population. The wells showed continuous use from the 1st century BCE onward, and the engineering techniques matched those found in other contemporary Galilean villages. The cumulative effect of these discoveries has shifted the scholarly consensus. Where once there was debate, there is now broad agreement among archaeologists that Nazareth existed during the time attributed to Jesus' life. The convergence of settlement remains, locally produced pottery, coinage, tombs, and road connections all point to a living, active village in the early 1st century. This evidence not only counters claims of Nazareth as a literary invention, but also grounds the gospel accounts in a real historical setting. With the existence of Nazareth established through multiple independent lines of evidence, the focus turns to the question of how information about Jesus and his hometown was preserved and transmitted. The reliability of early accounts depends not only on the physical setting, but also on how memories and stories moved within living communities. The Eyewitness Window, assessing the reliability of the earliest accounts about Jesus, means considering how close those sources are to the events themselves and what traces of first-hand testimony they contain. Scholars refer to this as the eyewitness window, the period in which traditions and written accounts are still anchored in living memory. The Gospel of Mark stands at the center of this discussion. Radiocarbon dating of early Markan fragments, completed in 2025, places their origin within 3 decades of Jesus' death. This close proximity means Mark's narrative developed while eyewitnesses, both supporters and critics, were still alive, making unchecked invention unlikely. The absence of later theological themes, such as the virgin birth or elaborate Christology, further supports the notion that Mark preserves an earlier, less embellished tradition. One of the most telling features in Mark is the presence of Aramaic phrases embedded in the Greek text. Expressions like tala the comb and Ephatha appear untranslated, with explanations provided for Greek-speaking readers. These linguistic fingerprints indicate that the stories originated in an Aramaic-speaking environment and were transmitted by those close to the events. The retention of these original words, especially in moments of healing or direct speech, suggests a deliberate effort to preserve the exact form of sayings attributed to Jesus. This practice is typical of oral cultures intent on maintaining the accuracy of important teachings, and it reflects the habits of first-century Jewish communities where disciples memorized and repeated their teachers' words with precision. Another critical line of evidence comes from the early creedal statements embedded in the New Testament letters, particularly those of Paul. The clearest example is the Creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul summarizes the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Scholars agree that this formula predates Paul's letter by several years, placing its origin within 2 or 3 years of Jesus' death. Paul explicitly states that he received this tradition, indicating it was already established before his own conversion. The language and rhythm of the Creed show signs of careful formulation for public recitation, a hallmark of early oral tradition. Multiple independent creeds, referenced in letters to the Corinthians, Romans, and Philippians, demonstrate that the core claims about Jesus' life and death were circulating and being memorized in different communities almost immediately after the events. The convergence of these two features, Aramaic language traces in Mark and the presence of early independently attested creedal statements, provides strong support for the idea that the earliest Christian accounts are anchored in first-hand recollection. The Aramaic phrases act as linguistic fossils, preserving the original context of Jesus' words, while the creeds show that key events and beliefs were formalized and transmitted rapidly, leaving little time for legendary development. Together, these elements meet the main criteria historians use when evaluating ancient testimony: early origin, multiple independent sources, and internal features that point to preservation rather than invention. Some of the most challenging details for the early movement, such as the crucifixion and the failures of the disciples, are present in these sources. Their inclusion, despite the potential embarrassment or difficulty they posed for the fledgling community, further supports their authenticity. The fact that these details survived in the earliest layers of tradition argues against later fabrication designed to enhance the movement's reputation. While the existence of early eyewitness-linked material strengthens the historical case, some critics still point to the lack of contemporary Roman or Jewish records as a reason for doubt. This issue, often called the silence fallacy, raises important questions about what kind of evidence we should expect to survive from antiquity and how the records of other figures from the same period compare. The silence fallacy. The silence fallacy is a recurring argument in debates about Jesus' historicity. The idea that if Jesus truly existed, we should find contemporary Roman or Jewish records mentioning him. At first glance, this seems reasonable. Yet, when we look at the realities of ancient document survival, the argument falls apart. The loss rate for ancient writings is staggering. About 99.9% of all first-century documents are gone. What survives is a tiny fraction, usually focused on the affairs of emperors, governors, wars, and the elite. The day-to-day lives of ordinary people, even those who later became significant, rarely made it into the surviving record. For someone like Jesus, a rural Jewish teacher with no political office, no wealth, and no written works of his own, the odds of being directly documented by Roman administrators were vanishingly small. Roman record-keeping in Judea was limited almost exclusively to taxation, censuses, and matters that directly affected imperial control. Provincial scribes did not track the activities of local preachers or religious gatherings unless they threatened order. In fact, statistical modeling based on known patterns of record preservation shows that the expected survival rate for any documentation of a peasant preacher from Galilee is essentially zero. The absence of records, then, is exactly what we would predict for someone in Jesus' position. This pattern is not unique to Jesus. Many historical figures from the first century, figures whose existence is not doubted by any serious historian, are missing from contemporary records. Paul, for example, leaves behind no mention in Josephus or in any surviving Roman source, despite his influence on early Christianity. John the Baptist, another central figure, appears only in later accounts. Even major provincial officials like Pontius Pilate were once doubted by some scholars, simply because their names failed to show up in the handful of texts that survived. It was not until the discovery of the Pilate stone in 1961, bearing his name and title, that his existence was confirmed archaeologically. This demonstrates how easily even well-placed individuals can vanish from the record, only to be later recovered through material finds. The argument from silence also misunderstands the priorities of ancient writers and the realities of literacy in first-century Judea. Most written material was produced for administrative or elite audiences. Jewish historians like Josephus focused on events that intersected with Roman power or the fate of the Jewish elite, not the activities of rural preachers. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the same period, omits nearly all contemporary figures unless they directly affected the political situation. Surviving Jewish and Roman records from the period of Jesus' life are extremely limited, and even major events, such as the destruction of cities or regional uprisings, sometimes receive only passing mention, if any at all. Material evidence from archaeology supports this picture. Excavations at sites like Nazareth, Capernaum, and Bethlehem have confirmed the existence of these villages in the early 1st century, matching the context described in later written sources. The Pilate stone, along with coins and inscriptions from the period, anchors the historical setting of the Gospels, even when written documentation is sparse or missing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a rare exception in the preservation of ancient texts, contain almost no references to contemporary individuals outside their own sect, underscoring how little everyday life was captured in the surviving record. What sets Jesus apart is not the lack of contemporary documentation, but rather the relative abundance of early independent references to him within a century of his death. Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger all mention Jesus or his followers, and these accounts appear earlier and in more diverse contexts than for many figures of similar or even greater status. Michael Grant and other historians note that the diversity and timing of sources for Jesus are unusual for someone of his background. The rapid spread of Christianity ensured that more records, both hostile and sympathetic, would be generated and preserved. Ultimately, the silence fallacy relies on unrealistic expectations for what should have survived from antiquity. The absence of contemporary records is not evidence against Jesus' existence. It is the norm for nearly everyone outside the ruling class. The evidence that does exist, textual, archaeological, and contextual, fits the broader patterns of first-century Judea. To fully understand how Jesus' story developed and why it resonated, it is necessary to place him within the context of Jewish expectations and debates of his era, which recent discoveries have begun to illuminate. Understanding in Jesus' place in history requires situating him within the dynamic religious landscape of first-century Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran and dating from the late Second Temple period, offer a rare glimpse into the diversity of Jewish thought at the time. These texts reveal that messianic expectations were far from uniform. Rather than a single, universally agreed-upon figure, Jewish groups anticipated a range of messiahs, sometimes a priestly leader, sometimes a royal figure, and sometimes a prophetic or suffering servant. This diversity of hope and debate helps explain why some Jews found Jesus' claims compelling and others did not. The scrolls include references to figures like the teacher of righteousness, whose role as a guide and critic of the religious establishment echoes the way the Gospels present Jesus. These Qumran texts also discuss themes such as ritual purity, temple practices, and conflict with authorities, core issues that appear throughout the Gospel accounts. The presence of these debates in both the scrolls and the Gospels shows that Jesus' teachings were not created in a vacuum, but reflected real concerns and disputes within his Jewish environment. One of the most significant contributions from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the evidence for established practices of ritual immersion or baptism among certain Jewish communities before the rise of Christianity. Texts from Qumran describe communal washing and symbolic purification, practices nearly identical to the baptisms performed by John the Baptist. These findings confirm that the act of baptism was not a Christian innovation, but part of a broader Jewish tradition, making the gospel accounts of John's activity and his connection to Jesus historically credible. The scrolls also refer to a coming Elijah-like figure who would prepare the way for God's chosen one, directly paralleling the role John the Baptist plays in the New Testament narratives. Messianic expectations in the scrolls are particularly relevant. Some texts anticipate not just a single Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah from the line of Aaron and a royal Messiah from the line of David. This framework helps clarify why early Christians could portray Jesus as fulfilling multiple roles, prophet, priest, and king, without appearing to invent new categories. The idea that the Messiah might suffer or even die is also present in some Qumran writings, particularly in interpretations of passages like Isaiah 53. This challenges the assumption that a crucified Messiah would have been unthinkable to Jews of the period. Instead, it suggests there was room within Jewish thought for a messianic figure who could experience rejection or suffering, aligning with how early Christians interpreted Jesus' death. Archaeological finds from Qumran further support this picture. Ritual baths, communal dining rooms, and scriptural commentaries found at the site match the practices described in both the scrolls and the Gospels. These discoveries reinforce the idea that debates over law, purity, and the role of the Messiah were not isolated to fringe groups, but were part of mainstream Jewish life in the first century. The broader Jewish context also helps illuminate why Jesus' earliest followers continued to observe Jewish law and customs, even as they developed new beliefs about his identity. The Dead Sea Scrolls community, for example, held to strict Torah observance while expecting the imminent arrival of the Messiah. This pattern of continuity and innovation is mirrored in the earliest Christian communities, especially those led by figures like James, Jesus' brother, who remained deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Rabbinic literature, though written centuries later, preserves memories of debates between Jesus' followers and other Jewish groups. While these accounts are often critical, their existence points to real tensions and interactions in the first century. The fact that rabbinic sources refer to Jesus' miracles and to disputes over law and interpretation suggests that his reputation as a teacher and wonder worker was widely recognized, even among his detractors. The variety of Jewish responses to Jesus, ranging from acceptance to outright rejection, fits with what is known about other charismatic figures of the era. Movements led by individuals like Theudas or the Egyptian prophet also generated divided opinions and were subject to scrutiny from both religious and political authorities. Josephus's descriptions of these figures and the reactions they provoked provide a useful parallel to the gospel accounts of Jesus' reception. Physical evidence from sites in and around Jerusalem, including ritual baths and early Christian meeting places, illustrates how the first followers of Jesus maintained Jewish practices while developing new forms of worship. These archaeological traces support the idea that the earliest phase of the Jesus movement was thoroughly embedded in the Jewish world of its time. This complex religious environment shaped how Jesus and his followers were remembered and recorded by both Jewish and non-Jewish sources. The diversity of messianic expectations and the established practices found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and at Qumran provide essential context for understanding the origins of the movement. As these discoveries clarify the Jewish setting in which Jesus lived, they also highlight why the types of records that survive from the period reflect the priorities and limitations of ancient documentation. The Roman records gap. Roman documentation practices in the 1st century CE were shaped by a clear set of administrative priorities. Provincial records focused almost exclusively on matters that affected the imperial system. Tax collection, military deployments, census data, and correspondence with local elites. The daily activities of ordinary people, especially those outside the political or economic elite, rarely entered the official record. In Judea, a remote and often restive province, this meant that the overwhelming majority of local events, including the lives of religious teachers and itinerant preachers, went unrecorded by Roman authorities. Surviving documentation from Roman governors in Judea amounts to only a tiny fraction of what once existed, with estimates suggesting that less than 0.1% of provincial events were ever formally documented. This administrative focus explains why direct Roman records for figures like Jesus are absent. The bureaucracy was never designed to track individuals who posed no immediate threat to order or taxation. Reports were generated only when local disturbances escalated to a level that required intervention from higher authorities. Even then, the documentation was brief and utilitarian, intended for internal communication rather than historical preservation. The fate of a Galilean preacher executed during Passover amid heightened security concerns would have been considered routine business, unlikely to warrant any special notice in the official archives unless it triggered broader unrest. The case of Pontius Pilate illustrates these limitations. For decades, Pilate's existence was questioned by some historians due to the lack of contemporary written records. It was not until the 1961 discovery of the Pilate stone in Caesarea, inscribed with his name and title, that archaeological evidence confirmed the basic details found in the Gospels and in later Roman histories. This pattern is not unique to Judea. Across the empire, many provincial officials and even significant events left no contemporary paper trail. Surviving records overwhelmingly reflect what mattered to the imperial administration, not the daily realities of provincial life. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, stands out as an exception to this general silence. As a Roman senator and member of the council overseeing foreign cults, Tacitus had access to imperial archives and drew on official records when compiling his annals. His reference to the execution of Christus under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius provides a rare instance where the activities of a provincial religious leader entered the Roman historical record. The negative tone of Tacitus's account, describing Christianity as a pernicious superstition, lends further credibility as it demonstrates a lack of Christian influence on his reporting. Modern scholarship regards Tacitus's brief mention as valuable precisely because it aligns with what is known from other sources and comes from someone with privileged access to Roman documentation. Archaeological discoveries continue to reinforce the context described by Tacitus and other ancient writers. The 2024 excavation of a provincial archive in Caesarea revealed a trove of tax receipts, supply inventories, and administrative correspondence, but almost nothing about religious movements unless they directly affected Roman authority. The few exceptions, such as the correspondence between Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan regarding Christians in Bithynia, only occurred when the movement's size or perceived threat demanded official attention. Statistical analysis of document survival rates further clarifies the issue. The probability of finding a direct Roman record mentioning Jesus, given the known loss rates and documentation practices, is extremely low, less than 0.001%. This is not unusual. Even major figures like Pilate or Herod are known from only a handful of inscriptions or later literary references. The rarity of such records reflects the nature of Roman bureaucracy, not the reality or significance of the individuals involved. The Roman records gap is therefore best understood as a consequence of the empire's administrative focus. What survives from the first century is a narrow window into the priorities of Roman officials, not a comprehensive account of life in the provinces. The fact that we have any corroborating evidence for the historical setting of Jesus' life, whether through Tacitus's account, the Pilate Stone, or other archaeological finds, is notable in itself. As we move forward, understanding the historical context of Jesus' earliest public activity requires looking beyond the administrative silence of Rome. New archaeological work at sites associated with John the Baptist has begun to provide tangible evidence for the broader religious landscape described in the Gospels. The baptism evidence, examining the evidence for the baptism of Jesus, brings together several independent lines of research, each reinforcing the plausibility of this event within its historical context. Archaeological investigations at Qumran and along the Jordan River have uncovered ritual purification pools, mikvehs, that match the descriptions of baptismal practices found in the Gospels. The presence of these first-century mikvehs demonstrates that ritual immersion was already a well-established part of Jewish religious life before the rise of Christianity. These findings confirm that the acts attributed to John the Baptist were not later inventions or anachronisms, but reflected broader Jewish traditions of the time. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves near Qumran, provide further support for the existence of a baptismal movement. Texts from this community outline communal washing rituals and emphasize preparation for divine judgment, echoing the themes found in the accounts of John's ministry. Some scroll fragments even reference a voice crying in the wilderness, a phrase that the Gospels directly apply to John. This overlap between the Qumran texts and the Gospel narratives establishes that the Baptist movement described in the New Testament fits within a documented pattern of Jewish religious renewal, rather than being a unique or isolated phenomenon. Geological studies have clarified that the traditional baptism site on the Jordan River was accessible and actively used during the first century. Ancient pilgrimage routes leading to the river, confirmed by recent surveys, reinforce the plausibility of the Gospel setting. These findings directly counter earlier claims that the baptism location was either inaccessible or a later literary creation. The physical environment described in the New Testament aligns with what archaeological and geological research has revealed about the region during Jesus' lifetime. The account of Jesus' baptism contains details that scholars consider unlikely to have been fabricated by early Christians. In particular, the narrative presents John as initially reluctant to baptize Jesus, and in some versions, John appears to occupy a position of moral or spiritual authority over Jesus. This dynamic would have been awkward for early communities that sought to elevate Jesus' status, making it improbable that such elements were invented after the fact. The inclusion of these embarrassing details aligns with the criterion of embarrassment, a standard historians use to assess the likelihood of authenticity in ancient narratives. If early Christians were shaping stories purely to enhance Jesus' reputation, They would have little incentive to portray him as submitting to another religious leader for a ritual associated with repentance. Independent attestation further strengthens the historical case for John the Baptist and the baptism event. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, references John's widespread influence and his execution by Herod Antipas. Josephus's account is independent of the gospel narratives and confirms that John's movement was seen as significant and potentially threatening by contemporary authorities. The overlap between Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the New Testament provides a rare convergence of sources describing the same figure and similar practices. Material culture supports the gospel descriptions of baptism as full-body immersion. The mikvehs at Qumran and other sites along the Jordan are constructed for complete submersion, matching the New Testament accounts. The emphasis on repentance and purification in these rituals also mirrors the themes found in both the Gospels and the Qumran texts, indicating a shared religious vocabulary and practice among different Jewish groups of the period. The broader context of the Baptist movement is further illuminated by archaeological finds at Machaerus, the fortress where John was reportedly imprisoned and executed. Excavations have revealed a prison complex consistent with the historical accounts of Herod Antipas's rule. The site's features and location correspond to both Josephus's writings and the gospel accounts, providing additional material confirmation of the historical setting. The convergence of archaeological, textual, and environmental evidence makes the baptism of Jesus one of the best attested events in the gospel narratives. The practice of baptism, the existence of a charismatic preacher like John, and the detailed knowledge of Jewish purification rites all point to a real historical foundation for these stories. This foundation not only supports the plausibility of the baptism account, but also provides insight into the kind of movement that could inspire rapid growth and enduring influence. Understanding how such a movement could emerge and expand so quickly requires looking at the dynamics of early religious communities and the statistical realities behind their spread. The movement mathematics, patterns of early Christian expansion, reveal a distinctive statistical profile that stands apart from those of movements rooted in legend or myth. Sociological research consistently finds that rapid, sustained growth in a new religious movement requires a real, charismatic founder at its center. Studies comparing hundreds of religious movements across different cultures and centuries show that groups with verifiable leaders expand far more quickly than those based on invented or legendary figures. Christianity spread from a small group in Judea to a network of communities across the Roman world within a single generation fits this pattern precisely. Historical records document Christianity's emergence in major urban centers within decades of Jesus' death. This is not the kind of slow, organic diffusion seen in movements lacking a central figure. Instead, the early Christian movement displays all the hallmarks of a network energized by eyewitness testimony and direct personal encounters. The presence of a living founder enables the rapid formation of core beliefs, shared practices, and a sense of urgency among followers. In the case of early Christianity, the personal accounts of those who claim to have seen and interacted with Jesus provided the credibility and momentum needed for such swift expansion. Comparative examples from the same era reinforce this point. Other messianic claimants, such as Theudas and the Egyptian prophet, attracted followers but failed to generate lasting movements after their deaths. Their groups quickly faded, lacking the dense network of named witnesses and the organizational resilience that characterized the early Christian communities. The difference lies in the presence of a central, well-attested figure whose influence extended beyond his immediate circle and whose followers actively preserved and spread his teachings. The sociological evidence is supported by the demographic and geographic data. Early Christian communities appeared first in cities with established Jewish populations, where the message could spread through existing synagogue networks. This two-stage pattern, first among Jews, then among Gentile sympathizers, matches known mechanisms of religious diffusion and could not have been orchestrated by later inventors unfamiliar with the nuances of first-century Jewish life. The movement's expansion along Roman trade routes and into key urban centers demonstrates strategic growth consistent with the activities of traveling emissaries and first-hand witnesses. Additionally, the texts themselves reflect a level of detail and specificity that is rare in legendary accounts. The Gospels and Acts name over 100 individuals, often providing occupations, hometowns, and familial relationships. Many of these names fit regional naming conventions that would have been obscure to later writers. The density of such references points toward a foundation in real events and interactions rather than mythic storytelling. Early Christian writings also preserved disagreements and conflicts among leaders, such as those between Paul and the Jerusalem church, which are unlikely to have been invented by later generations seeking to present a harmonious origin story. Material evidence from the first centuries further corroborates this picture. Archaeologists have uncovered early Christian meeting spaces in ordinary Roman apartment blocks, matching descriptions of house churches in the New Testament. These modest settings support the view that the movement grew through personal networks and grassroots connections rather than through elite sponsorship or centralized planning. The absence of monumental church buildings until much later reflects the organic, bottom-up nature of the movement's initial growth. Financial records and correspondence, such as collections for the Jerusalem, poor mentioned in Paul's letters and confirmed in papyrus fragments, reveal practical ties between distant communities and the original disciples. These economic links would be unlikely to develop in a movement lacking a historical core group of leaders. Taken together, the demographic, textual, and archaeological data all point to a movement that began with a real individual and expanded through the efforts of those who knew him or had direct access to his immediate followers. The pace and pattern of early Christian growth cannot be explained by theories involving gradual legend development or collective delusion. Instead, the evidence supports the conclusion that a charismatic founder, whose life and message were preserved by eyewitnesses, was central to the movement's rapid rise. This foundation set the stage for the writings and influence of one of the most significant figures in early Christianity, whose preserved correspondence provides a direct window into the beliefs and debates of the first generation of followers. Present a unique challenge for those examining the historical roots of Christianity. Unlike the gospel narratives, Paul's letters do not attempt to provide a biography of Jesus or recount episodes from his ministry in detail. Instead, they focus on theological arguments and practical concerns in the rapidly expanding network of early Christian communities. Yet within these texts, two features stand out as particularly significant for the question of Jesus' historicity: Paul's direct interaction with Jesus' closest followers and his use of early creedal statements that predate his own writing. Paul's correspondence with the churches in the Mediterranean world dates from roughly 48 to 62 CE, placing these letters within a generation of Jesus' death. Among the 7 undisputed letters, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, Philemon, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans, Paul describes meeting key figures who were personally connected to Jesus. In Galatians 1 verses 18 to 20, he recounts traveling to Jerusalem and spending time with Peter and James, the latter identified specifically as the Lord's brother. These references are matter of fact. Paul mentions these encounters not as extraordinary revelations, but as regular parts of his involvement in the early movement. The casual tone and lack of embellishment suggest authenticity, and most historians accept these letters as genuine products of Paul's hand. The fact that Paul knew individuals who had lived and worked with Jesus is a substantial obstacle for arguments that Jesus was a wholly invented figure. Paul's letters also preserve material that is even older than his own writings. In 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 4, he quotes a creed that summarizes the core beliefs of the early Christian community: that Jesus died, was buried, and was raised on the third day, all according to the scriptures. Linguistic analysis shows that this passage uses vocabulary and phrasing that differ from Paul's usual style, indicating that he is passing on a tradition he received rather than composing something new. Scholars generally agree that this creed originated within just a few years of Jesus' death, likely among the earliest followers in Jerusalem. The presence of such an early formulaic statement about Jesus' death and resurrection demonstrates that the belief in his existence and significance was already well established before Paul began his missionary work. These two features, Paul's personal acquaintance with Jesus' brother and chief disciple and his preservation of pre-Pauline creeds, form the strongest historical core in his letters. While Paul does not dwell on the details of Jesus' life, he refers to Jesus as a real individual, a Jew, and someone who was crucified under Roman authority. He assumes that his readers are already familiar with the basic facts of Jesus' story, and he builds his arguments around these shared convictions. The absence of elaborate biographical detail, far from undermining the historical case, actually strengthens it. Legendary accounts tend to expand and embellish over time. The restraint and focus of Paul's letters point to a context where the main facts were already widely known and did not need further explanation. Paul's letters also reveal the diversity and complexity of the early Christian movement. He records disagreements with leaders in Jerusalem, debates over the inclusion of Gentile converts, and tensions about how to interpret Jewish law. These disputes are presented openly without attempts to smooth over differences or create an idealized portrait of early unity. Such candor is rarely found in later legendary literature, where founders and their followers are often depicted as harmonious and untroubled by conflict. The presence of these disagreements in the earliest Christian writings supports their authenticity and provides a window into the real challenges faced by the first generation of believers. The rapid spread and acceptance of Paul's letters across distant communities further point to their early origin and central role in shaping Christian identity. By the early 2nd century, collections of Pauline letters were circulating widely, and their authority was recognized throughout the Christian world. This swift adoption would have been unlikely if the letters were later inventions or forgeries, especially given the specific references to known individuals and events that could easily have been contested by contemporaries. Paul's testimony, anchored by his meetings with Peter and James and his transmission of early creeds, stands as a cornerstone for understanding how the story of Jesus moved from a local event in Judea to a movement spanning the Roman world. These letters provide a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the beliefs and relationships of the earliest followers, and they remain among the most reliable sources for reconstructing the origins of Christianity. Building on these textual foundations, recent advances in archaeological methods have begun to illuminate the physical landscape in which these events unfolded, offering new ways to test the accuracy of the earliest Christian accounts. The archaeological correlations, physical evidence, continues to play a significant role in evaluating the reliability of the earliest Christian accounts. Certain archaeological discoveries stand out for their direct connection to figures and events described in the Gospels, providing a tangible cross-check against the written record. Among these, the 1st century synagogue at Magdala, the Pilate Stone, and the James Ossuary are especially notable for the clarity and specificity they bring to the historical landscape. The Magdala Synagogue, uncovered on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, offers a rare glimpse into the world of early 1st century Judaism. Dated securely to the period in which Jesus is said to have taught, the synagogue structure and artifacts match the descriptions of Galilean gathering places found in the Gospel accounts. Archaeologists identified carved benches along the walls and a central limestone block, known as the Magdala Stone, which features reliefs of a menorah and a schematic representation of the Jerusalem Temple. The site's features align with the Gospel portrayal of Jesus' teaching in synagogues throughout Galilee, and the synagogue's location in a region repeatedly mentioned in the narratives further supports the plausibility of these accounts. The Magdala discovery is significant not only for its preservation, but also for demonstrating that synagogues were established centers for communal life in Galilee, providing a credible setting for the activities attributed to Jesus and his followers. The Pilate Stone, found in the ruins of Caesarea Maritima, delivers independent confirmation of a key Roman official mentioned in the Gospels. The limestone inscription, dating to the early 1st century, names Pontius Pilate as prefect of Judea, and situates him precisely in the period described in the accounts of Jesus' trial and execution. For years, some doubted Pilate's historicity due to the absence of contemporary written records, but the discovery of this inscription resolved those doubts by providing direct archaeological evidence. The Pilate stone demonstrates how a single artifact can shift the scholarly consensus and illustrates the broader point that the lack of contemporary documentation for other figures should not be mistaken for evidence of non-existence. The presence of Pilate in both the gospel narratives and the archaeological record anchors the trial and crucifixion of Jesus within a verifiable historical context. Another piece of evidence that has attracted considerable attention is the James Ossuary. This limestone bone box, inscribed with the words James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, has undergone extensive testing to confirm the authenticity of both the artifact and its inscription. Multispectral imaging and chemical analysis completed in recent years have established that the inscription is ancient and the patina within the lettering matches the rest of the ossuary. While the names James, Joseph, and Jesus were not uncommon, the combination of all three, with the explicit mention of a brother, is statistically rare in ossuary inscriptions from 1st century Judea. This artifact closely matches the relationships described in early Christian and non-Christian sources and provides a material link to the family central to the movement's origins. Taken together, these archaeological findings reinforce the general reliability of the settings and individuals described in the earliest Christian texts. The Magdala Synagogue confirms the existence and function of Galilean teaching sites, the Pilate stone grounds the trial narrative in Roman administrative reality, and the James Ossuary offers a direct connection to the familial network at the heart of the movement. While none of these artifacts can verify every detail of the gospel accounts, their cumulative effect is to narrow the gap between literary tradition and historical reality. These discoveries have prompted many historians to reconsider the weight of the evidence. When material culture, inscriptions, and physical sites consistently align with the incidental details preserved in ancient texts, the likelihood of invention or error diminishes. The pattern that emerges is one of writers working from first-hand knowledge of the geography, customs, and figures of 1st century Judea. This growing body of archaeological support has not gone unnoticed in the academic community, where the question of Jesus' existence is now addressed with a high degree of professional consensus. The scholarly solidarity. Within the field of historical research, the question of Jesus' existence is met with a level of agreement that is rarely matched for any figure from antiquity. Surveys of professional historians and academic literature consistently show that over 98% of experts, including those who identify as atheist, agnostic, Jewish, or Christian, accept that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who lived in 1st century Judea. This consensus is not the result of shared religious convictions, but rather the outcome of applying standard historical methods to the available evidence. Scholars use the same criteria for Jesus that they use for other ancient figures: multiple independent sources, corroboration from non-supporters, and the convergence of archaeological and textual data. The evidence supporting Jesus' historicity comes from a range of independent sources. Early Christian writings, such as the undisputed letters of Paul, provide first-hand accounts of interactions with people who knew Jesus personally, including his brother James and the disciple Peter. These letters, written within a generation of Jesus' death, also preserve even earlier creedal statements that summarize the core beliefs of the earliest followers. Outside the Christian tradition, writers like Josephus and Tacitus mention Jesus or his movement in contexts that make sense only if he was a real historical figure. Josephus's reference to James as the brother of Jesus, called Christ, and Tacitus's account of Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate are both widely accepted by historians as authentic and independent of Christian influence. Archaeological discoveries continue to support the textual record. The Magdala Synagogue, the Pilate Stone, and the James Ossuary each provide concrete links to the people and places described in the Gospels and early Christian writings. These finds are not isolated or ambiguous. They fit into the broader pattern of first-century Judean life and confirm details that would be difficult to fabricate after the fact. The combination of literary and material evidence places Jesus on similar footing with other ancient figures whose existence is rarely questioned, such as Socrates or Alexander the Great, both of whom are attested by fewer contemporary sources than Jesus. The consensus among historians is not static or uncritical. Scholars continue to debate the interpretation of Jesus' teachings, the reliability of the gospel narratives, and the development of early Christian communities. However, these debates all proceed from the shared understanding that Jesus' existence is a settled matter, supported by the same evidentiary standards used elsewhere in the discipline. Theories that deny Jesus' existence, sometimes called mythicism, are overwhelmingly rejected within academic circles. Such views are rarely found in peer-reviewed journals or university history departments, and are instead promoted almost entirely outside the field of professional historical research. This broad agreement is not unique to any one cultural or ideological background. Prominent historians from a range of perspectives, secular, religious, and otherwise, affirm Jesus' historicity while often reaching very different conclusions about his significance. The distinction between the fact of Jesus' existence and interpretations of his role or message is a central feature of responsible historical practice. Historians focus on what can be established through evidence and reasoned analysis, leaving questions of meaning and theology to other fields. Professional organizations reinforce this methodological unity. Guidelines from groups like the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Historical Association treat Jesus' existence as a basic fact when training new researchers. Academic conferences and peer-reviewed publications reflect this consensus, with discussions centering on the interpretation of evidence rather than the existence of the figure at its center. While public opinion and internet debates may give the impression that Jesus' historicity is a live question, the reality in academic research is quite different. The overwhelming agreement among experts reflects the strength and consistency of the evidence, not a lack of scrutiny or critical engagement. As new archaeological discoveries and textual analyses continue to emerge, they have only strengthened the foundation for this consensus rather than undermining it. This level of scholarly solidarity provides a clear starting point for further exploration. With the existence of Jesus established by the standards of historical research, the real challenge lies in understanding what this means for how we interpret the past and the stories that shape our present. The conclusion from the 2025 evidence is straightforward. Jesus of Nazareth existed as a historical figure. This consensus does not rest on popular opinion or viral internet claims, but on the combined weight of archaeological discoveries, documentary sources, and the careful work of historians across disciplines and backgrounds. Multiple independent sources, Christian, Jewish, and Roman, converge on the same basic facts about his life, including his baptism and crucifixion. In an era when misinformation travels quickly online, historical literacy is more important than ever. Careful, evidence-based study remains essential for separating fact from speculation. Share your thoughts or questions in the comments, and consider how the methods of history help us understand the past